This is part 9 of the Craftsman Emerson Gen 2 Drill Press Rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 8, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we will be polishing parts. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. Okay, we're going to start off with the spindle pulley, and we will just chuck the shaft for this pulley inside my metal lathe. And then we're going to dry sand, wet sand, and polish this pulley. So there's still a good amount of, I don't know what all that is on the pulley, but it's already gone through a simple green bath, and I scrubbed it a little bit, but there's still a good amount of crud on this pulley. So for dry sanding on the pulleys, we're going to start with 80 grit sandpaper. Now, these pulleys are made out of Zamic, which is an alloy. So it will create quite a good amount of dust, but no big deal. So we're going to sand it with the 80 grit and then 100, 120, 220, and then 320. And then we're going to wet sand. So these pulleys are cast. So there are casting lines that are on them. And if you wanted to get real crazy, you could sand all those casting lines out of them as well. But they're taken down a good bit, you know, at the factory, so it's not a huge issue. And this certainly is not anything that you have to do when you're, you know, cleaning up or rebuilding your drill press. This is just something that I do pretty much to every drill press I rebuild, is polishing the pulleys. Maybe not so much once we get to the Gen 3s and the Gen 4s, because those pulleys are, you know, covered by the belt cover. And on the Gen 2, there's a belt cover as well, but you can actually see through the front of that belt cover. You can see the pulley. It's how you're supposed to be able to determine what speed the pulley or the drill press is spinning at. So I'm polishing them. Also of note is that these are the exact same pulleys, the spindle pulley assembly or the spindle pulley and the motor pulley. They're the exact same pulleys that are utilized on all of your previous generations. So your Emerson Gen 1s, which are really 150 drill presses, and your 100 series drill presses, they all use this same pulley for the spindle and the same motor pulley. It's a 5-inch diameter 4-step pulley. So after we've dry sanded and wet sanded, and for wet sanding we went ahead and sanded it with 400, 600, 800, and 1,000 grit, and we rinsed between each grit. We're going to come back and apply that Mother's Mag and aluminum polish. And then we're going to buff it off with a ShamWow. And you can see that this pulley is drastically cleaner and looks much better than it did before. So then I'm going to reverse the pulley and clean up the shaft. And for the cleaning of the shaft, I don't want to remove a whole lot of material because there are bearings that slide on this shaft. So we're just going to hit it with 400 grit, 600, 800, and 1,000. And that's pretty much it. We're not going to polish it or anything. But we're definitely not going to do any dry sanding on the shaft. And that is the spindle pulley. Next, we're going to do kind of the same thing with the motor pulley. And the inside diameter on this motor pulley is, I believe it's 5/8. Sometimes you'll see them with half-inch bore, but this one I think has a 5/8 bore. And I've just got a small piece of bar stock, 5/8 bar stock inside there. to give me something to grab onto with the jaws in the chuck. And of course it's tightened down with the set screw. And we're just going to dry sand and wet sand it exactly like we did the spindle pulley. And again, with the wet sanding, just make sure that you are rinsing between each grit. If you don't, then you're defeating the purpose of the wet sanding. And after we finish the wet sanding, then we're going to go ahead and polish the pulley with the mag and aluminum polish. And we will buff that off with a ShamWow. Then we're going to reverse this pulley. And when we reverse it this time, we're going to remove that shaft that we had in there. So what I didn't mention on the previous pulley is I also go ahead and just do a light cleaning on the inside of the shaft for each one of these pulleys, so that the bores on each one of these pulleys, so that they slide onto the shafts that they're supposed to without any interference. The spindle pulley obviously slides onto the spindle, and it's got grooves on the inside of it, and it engages with the splines that are on the spindle itself. And this one has got a smooth shaft on it, because it's or a smooth bore, because it slides onto the rotor shaft. So here we are with the quill, and with a lot of these parts that we're cleaning up now and polishing, we're not going to be using the dry sanding on very many of them. So for the quill, we're just going to wet sand, and I think we're starting at 400, and we're doing 400, 600, 800, and 1,000. And then we'll reverse the quill so that we can get that last bit that's inside the chuck, and do the exact same thing on that end. And I'll even go inside the bearing openings on each end of it with 1,000 grit and just sort of clean that up. We don't want to remove any material in there, just clean it up. Then we're going to come back and we're going to clean up the gear rack. And for this, I'm just going to use a small little brass brush on a Dremel. And then we'll clean that brass residue out with some Q-tips. Then we're going to come back and we're going to go ahead and apply that Mother's Mag and aluminum polish and buff it off. And do the same thing for the other end. And then we'll come back with Q-tips again and clean any of the polish out of the gear rack. And do a final buffing, and we're good there. And that's the quill. The center inside of the quill really doesn't matter because nothing touches it, and it's just an open space that the spindle slides through. So here we are with the rotor for the motor. That rhymes. And we're just going to clean up each end, each shaft end. And again, these are tight tolerances. We have bearings that slide on them. So we're just going to do the wet sanding. We're not even going to do polishing this time. We're just going to wet sand. And again, we're going to be doing 400, 600, 800, and 1,000. Now, if you decide to do this, this is probably the most dangerous piece that you're going to do this with. And that's because of those fan blades. So be careful. You do not want to get your finger caught in those fan blades because you will lose a finger. So if you watch as I get closer to the fan blades, my hand is much further away from the sanding pad, and I kind of bend it over the shaft and keep my fingers away from those fan blades. Remember to rinse between each grit. If you have to, stop the whatever you're spinning it in my case a lathe, to do the rinsing so that you don't lose a finger or the rag doesn't get grabbed by those fingers or those fan blades. And then we flip it over and do the exact same thing to the other side. And that is the rotor. You can come back and clean up that flat a little bit. I've seen them where they're pretty badly marred. And if you've got a really marred flat area on that that end of the shaft, you can hit it with a file to get those the set screw indentations out of it or whatever. So here we are with the pinion, and we're going to do kind of the same thing that we did with the quill. We're just going to wet sand it, but first I'm going to clean up the splines again on the pinion with that brass wheel on the Dremel. And then after we've got it cleaned up, then we'll move on with the wet sanding. So again, we're doing 400, 600, 800, and 1,000. We'll also wet sand the inside of the pinion. And I've got some areas that they're just sort of discolored. They don't really have a feel to them, but I end up hitting them a couple of times. Then we'll rotate it or flip it and do the same thing to the other end. And just remember to rinse between each grit. And once we are done with that 1,000 grit, we are done with the pinion. All right, so these are the feed handle rods, and there are 3 of them. And these aren't that bad. They still are chromed or whatever they do to them to make them look like chrome, whatever plating that is. But there is like a little bit of surface rust on them, so I'm just going to wet sand them and then come back and polish them with the mag and aluminum polish. And I'm just going to show you one of them, but we do the same thing with all 3 of them, and they turned out really good. So this is the spindle. If you remember, we cleaned up the splines on the spindle with the wire wheel on the grinder. So we're going to wet sand the rest of the spindle. And we're doing 400, 600, 800, and 1,000. And we're not going to touch the taper really until we get into that 800 and 1,000 grit. We don't want to cause any deforming to the taper. And then we'll polish all of that with the mag and aluminum polish. And we'll be doing a run-out test on the spindle in the next video. So there's your spindle completed. Next, we have the sleeve for the Jacobs chuck. And we did clean this up in the wire wheel, but now we're going to polish it. So it's got some pitting on it. So I'm going to dry sand it, and then we're going to wet sand it. So I'm starting with 100 grit. And we're going to go 100, 180, 220, and then 320. And that got it pretty smooth. Then we're going to wet sand, and we're going to do 400, 600, 800, and 1,000, rinsing between each grit. And then we're going to polish it with the mag and aluminum polish. And we got that sucker looking good. We'll just come back with a Q-tip and do some cleanup in those teeth. And that's the sleeve. So next we're going to do the chuck body. And to do the chuck body, we've got to spin it onto the spindle and reverse the direction of my lathe so that it won't come loose. And we're just going to sand the bottom section, so that entire bottom section there, and then the very top section. We're not touching that middle section in any way, because that middle section is very sharp, and it will rip the sandpaper out of your hand. It will rip anything that you try to run on it while it's spinning, to include your fingers. So not really going to mess with that. Then we're going to wet sand those two sections. Be very careful when you go with rinsing the rag. Stop the rotation if you have to. And then we're going to come back and we're going to polish those sections. And that is the chuck body. I'm really curious to find out what the run out is on this spindle. But like I said, we'll check that in the next video. So here we are with the feed handle knobs. And I'm using this Meguiar's cleaner wax. I've got an old feed handle rod chucked into the chuck that I use for this purpose. We're just going to apply this cleaner wax, and then we're going to buff it off. Now sometimes I'll sand and even I'll wet sand, and sometimes I'll even dry sand these knobs if they've got big chunks in them or big gouges in them. But these are in really good condition. So just hitting them with the cleaner wax, you can see it cleans them up big time. Makes them look almost brand new. And they're made out of Bakelite. Just in case you're wondering. Which is a plastic derivative before there really was plastic. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to come back and we're going to coat all of these parts with super slick stuff. And then we're going to wipe them down. Any of the bare metal that we polished. And, you know, this stuff is an excellent protectant. It will keep them from rusting for quite a while. So I think I said it in the previous video, but you can get that super slick stuff I get it from Ace Hardware. You can order it off of Amazon. And I've seen it for sale in at least one of the big box stores. Not sure which one, Home Depot or Lowe's, but they carry it. Big thing is you just don't want to use WD-40. WD-40's got water in it, and stuff will rust over time that has WD-40 on it. So coat these things and then wipe them down. And that is going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you've got any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below. Get to them as fast as I can. In the next video, we're going to be modifying the switch mounting plate and a couple of other things, including checking that run out. So, as always, I appreciate the support, and I will see you next time.